I guess we can go. Okay, cool. Hello, I'm Oak. I am your friend and your guide to the magical journey to the land of production and management, which is known by its definitive synonym, hell. Uh, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about why production, what production is, why production is, and what you can actually use it for, and how can you apply it to your own professional and maybe even just regular daily life. So there's going to be 10 main terms that I'm going to tackle right now, and in no particular order. First off, production itself. It's not about actual production like in factories per se, but it is still considered to be the production of a product. The end result is a product, so it's a production. It is a loose term, and in the game industry you can hear a lot of different definitions about this, but generally speaking, it's basically the process of completing a product, and product in this case being a game or a service, or sometimes they're both the same. And so when you have a production, you also have a producer. Now this term is even worse because it's even more vague most of the time. It stems from theater and cinema most of the time, also from music, and in those areas it's just as vague and just as horrible. It's the most specific in film, and in this case, in the game industry, the producer is more akin to the producer in theater shows, because most of the departments and the management and the specialties of people that you need to complete a theater production can be pretty much one-to-one transferable with game production. So you have the stage setters who are level designers, you have audio engineers, you have actors, you have managers, etc. Then creative vision. This is also something that is super vague generally, but I like to define it as basically the experience that you want to give the consumer or the customer of your product. And this is basically the end goal of a production. It's like an abstract idea in everybody's heads until it's done. And until that's done, you're dealing with a vision, not a product. Then creative executions deal with bringing the vision to life. This is going to have its own separate topic later on in the workshop, and I will go more in detail, but so far, just so you're familiar with the term, we're going to tackle this, and it's not about killing anybody. Then budget, I hope you're all familiar with the term generally, but I will be also tackling it in more specific definitions pertaining to the game industry, and trying to also bust some myths about it, that budgeting is only about money. It's really not like that most of the time, especially if you are on indie or AAA game production. Everything in the middle usually deals with budget in terms of money, but budget just usually means either internal or external value, which I will come back to as well later on. I will be talking briefly about what is a roadmap, and no, it's not about camping. It's about setting yourself a timeline for your product, for your production, for whatever you need, for whatever steps you need to take to actually make your product. Then value estimation, which is closely tied to budgeting, but has a completely different frame of reference. When budgeting is usually done internally focused, then value estimation is usually done externally. So basically, value estimation means how much bang for buck are you getting if, for example, you add great AI to your game. How much will that improve the user experience, for example? Then management, I will mostly talk about, since you voted for being more solo development focused, I'll be talking about personal management, And most of the time it's going to be emotional management, about how to distance and invest your emotions into your project at the right times and in the, let's say, healthy capacity, and dealing with different departments, meaning like different areas in your brain, pretty much. Then I will be talking about pipelines and workflows and how this terminology is used in the game industry, and also why they are used sometimes interchangeably. And right now, I can give you a little bit of a hint as well. A pipeline is basically an abstract idea for a workflow, and a workflow is a practical execution of a pipeline. But some people have their own definitions about that, and we'll come back to this as well later. Do you have any questions so far? Perfect. Next. So most of the time in production, when you're producing a game, you're going to be doing a lot of this. It's just a chart with some numbers on it, and it's supposed to give you a general idea of what's happening in a project, and like where things are going, what people are doing, what the responsibilities are. And generally, it's just not fun, actually. It's a lot of dry stuff. So the production element or the producer element in game development is usually quite taxing, both emotionally and physically, because you are going to have to be the glue that's holding everything together. You are going to be the executor of a creative vision, which means it's going to be especially hard when that's all going to be one person, and more about that soon. I'm going to tackle 5 main topics of production-related tasks and daily routines, kind of. And I will be outlining some tools and techniques that you can use for each of these. So if you are going to start taking notes, then I will tell you when is a good time to start. Right now, this is just an intro so that we set the tone about what we're going to talk about. So first off, it's going to be about budgeting. The tools are basically run-of-the-mill. You can use Google Docs, you can use Office, Microsoft or Libre or OpenOffice. You can use a cool a commercial tool called YNAB or YNAB, which is You Need a Budget, or anything equivalent. It's basically a glorified Excel as a standalone application meant specifically for budgeting projects. Now this deals with mostly the money part. So a lot of the time when you are planning your own project, you are actually going to have to come up with your own toolkit composed of smaller little tools. So I like to use Google Docs a lot, but I also use Notepad most of the time, and that's actually it's like the shovel and hammer of a producer is going to be Excel and Notepad. So you can pretty much use Excel and Notepad for everything, for value estimation, for management, for oversight, and also for the creative execution part. So incidentally, these are exactly the 5 topics that I'm going to tackle, and each of these can be approached in somewhat of a similar way, and it's all about decomposition, actually, not with corpses in this case, but with timelines, with features, with costs, with involved parties, etc. And each of these has a wide range of tools that you can use, and I'm going to show you a little bit how to use them as well. And so as a producer, or let's say when you're an indie developer and you want to handle and manage your production, what are you going to be doing? Most of the time it's going to be about solving problems. So it's like game development is about solving problems anyway, but with a producer, you're going to be solving problems between different aspects of game development. So asset production, implementation, marketing, business, etc. You are going to be solving problems between these subcategories, essentially. And it's going to be difficult to kind of not look at everything from a specialist point of view. So if you are solving let's say, a workflow problem between implementing your art assets into the game, you might go into the problem-solving part, looking at it as an artist, or as a tech artist, or as a programmer, or as a data manager. But it also helps if you do it from a production standpoint. So going for maximum efficiency and optimization, usually. That's the goal of all the problem solving. So you are going to be probably, like, if you have done games before in a team, then most of the time you're going to have somebody who is managing. If not, well, lucky or unlucky you. But a lot of the time, the tasks that you get assigned in a team are done so for a reason. And now, if you look at your game production from a producer standpoint, you are not telling yourself to do something because something needs to be done. You are going to tell yourself to do something knowing why it needs to be done. Because a lot of the time, this is forgotten when you're running a regular 9-to-5 job, for example, that bosses are there to tell you why you are doing things, not that you should just simply do things. If you have a boss who is just simply telling you to do things without telling you the whys, then it's a shitty boss. And this ties into the last and probably the most important like subcategory of tasks that you're going to do as a producer, is to assert clarity into your production, to know where and when something should be done, by whom, whether it's yourself, whether it's your outsourcing partner, whether it's your friend who composes music for you, or somebody, for example, if you're here in Spelkollektivet, somebody in the house that you want to ask help for or an advice, you would need to then look at it as kind of a puzzle that you piece together, knowing when you need to ask for help, then also knowing when to put that help into use, etc. So, oops, wrong button. So what happens if your team is just composed out of yourself? You're going to be dealing with different aspects of yourself, and yeah, it's going to feel a little bit like multi or schizophrenical, because you're going to have to bust your own ass, but not as a specialist, but as basically, yeah, a manager, essentially. If you're doing indie development, then self-management and self-organization is pretty much the name of the game. That's the only way you can actually get something done within reason and within a framework that you have created for yourself. So that brings us to the actual problem. So if you are a solo developer, then you are going to be bouncing between these departments, which I mentioned earlier. That's going to be about, for example, implementation or about asset production. And you might not know when the best time for it is, so you can just go about it as you feel is the best, essentially. That's also good if you just follow your gut feeling, but it helps massively to plan things out in advance, so you know where you are with your project and where you want to take it, where you want to focus the most, and what's going to give your game the value that you are going to give the people that are eventually, hopefully, going to play it. So it's a lot of words so far. It's probably a little bit overwhelming. I'm going to front load a lot of stuff here. But now we're going to tackle some things in a more specific manner. So now's the time to pretty much grab your laptops, because we're going to do a few exercises and see kind of what are the day-to-day things that you as a game producer then would be doing. First off, the budgeting. Why would you do budgeting? And how would you do it? First off, you would need something that handles text really well. You would need to have something that handles numbers really well. Mostly it's going to be about maths. It's going to be about percentage calculation. And it's going to be about essentially resource management. That's what budgeting actually is. Everything has a cost, whether it's time or money or loyalty or whatever. It can be something that's arbitrary. It's something that everything has an associated cost in life, kind of, and the value we apply to things is pretty much made up. But in game production, you have two main metrics for this, two main units that you can use as like concrete, to actually give concrete estimations for things about their costs, and I'm talking about intrinsic cost. This is time and money, usually. But it can be something else as well. It can be like friendship power, like you can collaborate with somebody. You can, essentially, like, it's still going to have maybe a strain on your relationship with a friend if you work on something without actually receiving something back, like aside from the pleasure of creation. But still, it's something that has somewhat of a cost. It's going to be somebody else's time, or yeah, whatever, something like this. So for whenever you are handling your project, you should be very upfront and honest about yourself, what kind of resources you have. Most importantly, how much time you have and how much time you're willing to put in. And secondly, how much money you have, because that's going to be affecting a lot of stuff. But you can work around all of these considerations, let's say you are, for example, living here. You are for the foreseeable future, you have rent covered and you have X amount of hours in your day to work on your game, and maybe X amount of hours to do outsourcing stuff to, let's say, support the lifestyle. You can just plan this out and see how much time you actually have in your hands and be realistic about it. Then also, when you're budgeting, you absolutely need to consider the relative cost of things. This is where percentage calculation comes in. If you make a game estimation where, let's say, for example, 80% of your time and budget is going to go into implementation of features and the rest is just going to be 20%, then there's an obvious discrepancy there, and you should take a look whether you have underestimated something or overestimated something, or are completely going in from a false angle, so to speak, so that your the base for your estimation is wrong, so you can adjust. So whenever you are doing a budget estimation, make sure that you also see how it fits into the bigger picture. Like, what is your like 100%? What does that mean for you? How much time, how much money, how much manpower that is generally, and see how, let's say, if you do feature estimation of how much it would cost, or an outsourcing thing, see how much that would cost. Also add in the money for managing the money and time associated with managing the outsourcing. Just check everything and double check it to see if it's still falling into place. And then when you're budgeting, three of the most important things that you need to be looking at is your runway, which is how long you are able to do whatever you are doing without having to change your daily life or lifestyle or work style. Then your burn or burn rate, which is how much resources you are going through each month, each week, each day, even a year. Having all of these scopes set up for you is really good. And then, of course, the project scope as well. We'll come back to the project scope later on, but that being said, whenever you're doing a budget for something, then essentially that's going to define a lot of your scope. A lot of the time when you're figuring out like what kind of features you would want to be implemented, what kind of production values generally would you want to have something that's like less features but more polished, or more features and a more cohesive experience but less polished. That's going to be affected by scope, and that's going to come into play for budgeting as well. And that's what's also going to be one of the exercises we're going to be doing.
Oh.
Yes, question?
Yes, can you explain the absolute versus relative again? I'm not sure what relative cost means.
So in the topic of absolute and relative cost, when you're making a budget for something, let's say you're making a budget for a monthly living, essentially. So you have your rent, utilities, I don't know what it's called in English, but it's basically your first needs, which is like food and medicine, water, the essentials basically. And then let's say you have a budget of 500 euros for all of that. So, and your rent is going to be like 300, your essentials is going to be 100, and leisure is going to be another 100. So, relatively speaking, each of these has a certain percentage. Your 100% is the $500 or euros. The leisure is 100, so that's 100 out of 500, so it's 1/5, so it's 20%, and that's the relative cost. So, and the absolute cost is just the flat money, so it's $100. That's the absolute value of it. It's not relative to anything. That's just how much things cost right now, and the relative cost is relative to the budget that you have, essentially. Yes.
Then maybe you'll get into this later, but what do you think about the way we reason about what we choose to spend money on? Like, are you going to cover that?
Yes. Basically, so the question was a reasoning about costs and where to put money. Yeah, we will be coming back to this in a later exercise as well. This will be covered mostly in value estimation, which is the third, if I remember correctly, the third topic. So we're going to get there quite soon. So yeah, why would you budget in the first place? Well, first of all, you're going to set some really easy to understand constraints for you, basically meaning if you can provide food and shelter for yourself for 12 months, that's going to be the time that you can work in this manner. You can have an estimation of hours every day or every week or every month that you can put into a project. It gives you a nice little fallback for reality checks and sanity checks. So it might sound harsh, but if you are doing something that is time limited in a way, and you should always time limit yourself in some way or another. So let's say you have 12 months, you're 6 months in, and you're thinking of radically changing the scope, either to be smaller or bigger, then you can go right back into your budget, recalculate and see what the impact is and do some risk assessment essentially before you commit to that decision, so that you have an idea of the long-term impact for your project as well. Like this happens to game development projects a lot, especially after the first phases of like MVP or first prototypes, where you see the things in action and then you want to start changing things. It's perfectly valid to do so, but I always recommend having some sort of new estimation and new calculation every time you do something, and not just going and doing it. Because if you know that it's going to be a major change, then it's going to affect your bottom line. Basically, it's going to affect maybe how much time you are able to focus on other things. So it all has this ripple effect. And this is what you're supposed to be doing as a producer, is that you're supposed to keep an eye on the bigger picture. And it also helps you to figure out where you're getting the most value back from where you put your time. So you can focus more on the aspects of your project that make it unique, make it your like signature style, make it appealing to your target audience, your players, and it's generally just a good thing to do if you want to know how long you can maintain your lifestyle, essentially. And now it's time for an exercise. So this is going to be the first one out of 5. And for this, you can use whatever tool you feel comfortable with. Either it's a Google Sheet, or draw it, or use a notepad and pen if you want to. I personally would recommend using like Excel or Microsoft Office or a Google Sheet. It's pretty much the easiest. And what we're going to do here is that it's a very basic budgeting exercise. I'm keeping it abstract for a reason, because it's mostly about the principles and not about the specifics. So what I would like you to do is that you have 40 units of something and 800 units of something else. First off, can somebody tell me or have a wild guess what these units might be? Yeah?
Time, there's 40 hours a week.
Yeah, 40 hours a week. And the 800?
Euros per month?
For example, I was going for just dollars or units of money, essentially. So let's say that you have 40 hours and 800 units of money to spare, and I would like you to allocate these into separate departments. There's not every department covered, but it's abstract enough to give you an idea. And basically ask you, where would you put all of this time and money in a week's schedule, essentially? If you were doing a very small prototype, it's time boxed into 40 hours and it's money boxed into $800, for example. And I will also join you on the exercise. So I'm hoping we're not going to break the, yes. And I'm just going to go to Google Docs.
Yeah, the $800 is external costs, right? It's non-living costs.
It can be, yeah, let's say that for the sake of the exercise, the 800 is for these things only.
So money set aside for the project.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly. So you can put the 800, like, this is going to be your 100%, these two, and these are going to be a part of this. So basically what you do, everything in the question mark boxes needs to add up to 40 and 800. Yeah.
But are the hours and money not like connected?
They don't have to be.
You don't have to pay people, like you don't have to assume that you also have to pay for the hours.
No. Basically, you can treat them as completely separate, but you can make them into a one-to-one relation if you want to. Yes?
What phase of prototype is this?
Sorry?
What phase of prototype is this?
Just initial, like, let's say, game jam type level, just putting shit together, essentially.
Quick clarification. I assume visual design is like the pre-production, and then the visuals is actual production.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wait, where's coding?
Implementation. Sorry?
Oh shit.
I erased it. Oops.
No coding needed, or
You
or
can,
should we add it, or
that's actually, yeah. I think I accidentally replaced it with something else, but you can consider it then to be part of game design. If you want to go for implementation and coding.
There's
Okay.
visuals and visual design.
Yeah, I think I might have mixed something up there.
Or maybe it's like a coder who is like looking for who's he going to hire for this project.
Yeah, for example. Okay, so I'm just going to make something of my own, and then we can compare notes. And just, I will ask you in about, don't overthink it, just do something quick in like 2 or 3 minutes, and then we can talk about what's going on. Is anybody still doing it? No? Okay. Then I would like to ask for a volunteer who would share their numbers and also maybe a short reasoning of why exactly this. Is anybody up for it? No? Okay, crazy. But, yeah.
I dumped almost all the money into visual design and visuals. I feel like that's probably the most important thing, just to get across the prototype and get that done solidly. And then aside from that, I think most of the time is going into game design and visual design to really get the core idea down, and then everything else feels like implementation level stuff that you can kind of skim on. So I've dumped those down to next to nothing.
Yep, nice. Do you want to share the hourly part of each?
Sure. For hours, it's 18 for game design, 10 visual design, 6 level design, 3 visuals, 1 audio, 2 QA.
Very nice. Okay. Anybody else? Yes, Len.
I put most of it into QA because I was thinking this should be like everything else that you have to deal with. So there's always these kinds of things. And I put 8 into game design, 4 into visual design, 3 into level design, 7 into visuals, 3 into audio, and 15 into Q&A.
Okay,
You
yeah.
also 18 in game design and Fraser as well? Because I'm also 18 in game
I had
design.
8.
So this is basically what I meant earlier with absolute and relative cost. So essentially, this is an exercise of taking apart a number, breaking it down to smaller numbers, and adding them back together and seeing if they fit. And the biggest problem in this kind of decomposition is that none of these numbers is actually just a number. It actually is an art asset, it's an audio file, it's a line of code, or it's somebody's sanity. So essentially, all of these numbers have some sort of like intrinsic value, and then it also has like an extended value into what it actually represents in real life. When you are doing time estimations in production, this is going to be your main thing. Like, for example, has any of you worked in a management position in a game studio before? By show of hands? Yes. Okay. Very nice. Yeah, that's fair. Like, you're probably familiar with a lot of this shit. There's going to be a lot of it for any sort of project, whether it's games or not. Most of the time, you're going to be crunching numbers and checking your books to see if everything falls back into place. So basically, what I'm trying to say is that you can't make a game that needs 3 years in 1 year's time. And this is this is the very basic technique you can use for doing these kinds of sanity checks. So I can explain a little bit how I also assembled my decomposition, so to speak. And I'm looking at it from a technical perspective here, and I did this like in a very focused manner. Let's say that I want to do a prototype that only has like one feature, but it feels pretty good to the player. So I'm putting in quite a lot of time into the game design itself, mostly about controls and also implementation. But then I need to make it look satisfying and rewarding. So that puts visual design on the second place. And thirdly, I would definitely want it to be polished. So I need to do quite a lot of testing. So I put a large emphasis on QA as well. And everything else is basically going to supplement whatever the core is. This is just one way of doing it. If you want to go for a more, let's say, more of a feeling kind of experience, then these numbers would be something completely different, like something like Lena or Fraser had. It was more about creating an expectation of the final product and not just like checking out how something works and seeing if it's worth it or not. And this also influences the way you spread out your like additional funds, so to speak. In addition to time, you also have some funds. Like let's say you can buy some assets on the store. You can contract somebody to do music for you. You can contract somebody to do level design for you. So essentially, all of this is going to be your budget. Budget is basically the time of you and other people, and also the leverage to kind of move that around. And the leverage most of the time is going to be money. So, next, value estimation. Now, this is going to be very similar. What is value estimation about? It's in kind of an inverse relationship with budget, because in budget, you are mostly talking about internal affairs, internal values, internal costs as well, because a lot of the time when you're doing budgeting, you're not really thinking about how is this going to shape the player experience, right? Because it's not supposed to really be part of the equation. When you're doing a budget, you're mostly focusing on you and your resources and what you can potentially do with them. then value estimation is practically speaking another level on top of that. And in this case, it's not about the internal stuff. It's now going to be about the external stuff, the stuff that the player sees. So when you're budgeting, you're doing bookkeeping for your company or yourself, trying to figure out how you pay rent and how you get food on the table. And with value estimation, you are going to be gauging how well you can hit a high review score on Steam compared to the resources that you have. So when budgeting itself is mostly focused on how you can spend resources on getting where you need to be, then value estimation tells you what are the best places to be at, basically. The best features to implement, what would give you the biggest gain in terms of production value, which is going to improve the perception or the quality of your game. The tools for this are also quite simple. Most of the time, value estimation comes down to design, a lot of it, and also market research. And market research should never be underestimated. So essentially, when you're doing a value estimation for your game, let's say your game is inspired by another game, then value estimation couldn't be more crucial because you are going to have competition, and that competition already exists, and it has a level of standard, it has a level of quality that's already been established. And now it's up to you to decide which parts you feel like you can excel and which parts you feel like you don't, like it's not a fair fight, it's not going to be feasible for you to compete in that regard. So, for example, when we were doing Death and Taxes, then we had a quite specific scope in mind, and we knew that we are never going to get to the, let's say, the artistic or gameplay rather depth of Papers, Please, for example, or Kingdom in terms of like balancing and such. So that just simply wasn't a fight that we were going to have to take. Instead, we focused more on the narrative. So we thought that what's going to be gripping for the player is going to be choices. It's not going to be the gameplay itself because we just don't have the resources for it. So looking at our resources that we had, we came up with a solution of, okay, we just excel in a different place. And whenever you're doing something for a target audience, you're going to be competing with something. So if you know what games your target audience likes to play, even if it's a completely different genre, it can be like, if you make a game for kids, then you're gonna have to compete against Minecraft and Fortnite in some ways, but there might be kids who hate both of these games, and maybe you can find a niche for yourself there, or you can find some overlap, but find where you can offer your players the most value. And this is exactly where this kind of problem-solving subtask comes into play. You figure out what would give you the most bang for your buck, I like to say. So why would you ever do this? Well, first of all, it's going to give you a direct impact on your impact. It's difficult to say. It's basically when your game has a certain quality for a specific feature, then people are going to be looking at it favorably if it's better than what they're used to, and looking at it unfavorably if it's not better or just as good compared to something else. Because the way psychology works is that we really like to compare things because it gives us a solid base to basically make an assumption or make, in this case, a comparison. So if you know where you are offering your players the most value, you can have the most impact there. And impact in this case, I mostly mean about market impact. So if you have a game that's going to be the ultimate in Dwarven life simulation, you are going to have Dwarf Fortress, but there's not a lot of else going on for that game, for example. They know that their value goes into the insanely complex simulation and systems that they have, but it's a bare bones game in terms of graphics or narrative or whatever. Their like most important factor for impact is actually emergent gameplay, and that comes from their systems-driven design. Secondly, it helps you figure out what the message of your game is going to be, and it's going to make you it's going to make it easier for you to talk about your game, what your game is going to be about. Again, I can bring Death and Taxes as an example. It's being it's like living the fantasy of being the Grim Reaper on an office job. It's very specific, and that's pretty much the value that we could give there. With other games, for example, that are top level, let's say Path of Exile, it gives you the fantasy of being an absolute demigod smashing through demons and constructs and aberrations and alike in an unprecedented way that it cannot be simply matched by anything else on the market right now. And it's important to note that the guys behind Path of Exile actually set out the goal for themselves to kill Diablo, so to speak. Not like the Diablo the Demon, but Diablo the game series. And essentially that's what they did. They created a splinter group of hack and slash fans and gave them this kind of value, identified that players would appreciate this kind of gameplay, and went with it. And most importantly, again, focus. It helps you figure out where to allocate your budget. So if you see that something is going to make or break your game, or is going to be really essential to your core gameplay experience, then that's where you should be putting your resources as well, figuring out how you're going to both make a market impact and also an impact on your players personally. What do they get out of it? And again, short exercise, different kind of spreadsheet now. It has still abstract numbers. So the 40, it's still, let's say that it's time. The 800, let's say that it's still money. And now we have a scale from 1 to 10. Does anybody want to guess what the 1 to 10 is?
Importance?
Yeah, it's practically, importance or value or priority, whatever you would like to call it. Essentially, it's your estimation on how impactful it would be for a game that you are making. So now we're specifically talking about the implementation, and so the development, the coding part specifically. So let's say you are a coder, or you're working with a coder, or essentially these are the two options. You are either a coder or you're working with a coder. And you have this feature set of character movement, AI, inventory, quests, management system, interactions, and combat. And with interactions, I just mean like anything that isn't combat, like picking something up, dropping it off, moving it around, for example, manipulating the game world. And now I would like you to do the same kind of estimation of importance or value, time and money spent, and do it equally, like not equally, but do it for this feature set essentially. And the game can be anything you can imagine in your head. Basically, you can take as much liberties as you want, and I will also copy this to the Google Sheet.
Do they all have to be there?
No, you can. It's
Can you put
completely
0
valid
as well?
to put 0 to everything if that's what you feel, what you want to do. And this is the whole point. I'm actually quite interested in seeing how it ends up.
I'm confused. Was this for a Diablo film?
No. It can be any game in your imagination, essentially.
Is 1 the most important?
Let's say that 10 is the most important, 1 is the least important. And these aspects, so to speak, are deliberately vague.
I was thinking that there's a lot of potential for interdependence here.
Yeah.
Quests and inventory.
Yep. If you want to have it, or also interactions and inventory, that would end up maybe in a bartering system. AI and inventory would maybe go into the realm of pickpocketing, for example. There can be a lot of interconnections basically, but it's about the idea you have in your head and how you would see it work together. You can also make some sort of an estimation for an abstract type of game. It can be like also your game that you're working on currently, or it might be something completely different. It can just be a game. Is anybody still allocating? I'll take that as no. Again, is there a volunteer who would like to share their estimations? I can just share mine. Essentially, but I would still like to ask by a show of hands, how many of you have a 0 somewhere in the importance or priority column? Okay. And then by show of fingers, how many 10s do you have?
Oh, we could have 10. Could you have 10 in more than one place?
That's up to you. Okay, cool. And how many of you, again by show of fingers, have a 5 somewhere in there?
Oh.
In the value?
In the value and priority, yeah. Okay. You have 5 5s?
Oh, no,
Oh, okay, one.
one.
Okay.
Fine.
Cool. So basically, you're doing it right. If you have something that is deprioritized, something that has a kind of a neutral priority, and something that has critical priority. This essentially, it's a little bit thinking in extremes, but that's kind of what you're supposed to be doing when you're asking about value. Yes?
I'm just wondering if, like, this idea of allocating value between 1 to 10, if it is related to like the idea in management, where you have a traffic light system with like green, yellow, and red light, and a red light is, if I remember correctly, it is saying like, okay, this is crucial. We don't know how to do it, so we need to research how to do it, and then and then you go up until like the green light, which says, okay, we know how to do it. It's no problem. We don't need to worry about that.
I would use a different kind of scale for it. Yeah, like I've used the traffic light system. I've done planning poker, for example, in Scrum. If we're talking about the complexity of a task, it would be another metric. I'm not going to tackle it here because it would be a little bit too complex, haha. But rather just for value estimation, especially, you should attempt to look away from how hard it is to solve the problem, to implement the feature, to make the asset, and focus more on what it would actually give back. Because that's when you get like an honest discourse between yourself or whoever you are working with, saying that, okay, this shit is going to be really difficult, but it's not going to be the game we wanted to do without it. And this kind of discourse is going to be very common when you're making any sort of game. If the people care about making it, that is, most of the time. It also goes into like personal values and creative vision. And value estimation is closely tied to creative vision, actually, because you are giving an abstract, like numerical or whatever linguistical value to a feature that is not there yet, but you feel is going to play a large role in the experience of the game. So why are the numbers on my screen like this? Well, let's say I want to make a walking simulator. It's going to be a puzzle game as well, a little bit. And judging by my own resources, I would like the character movement to be really satisfying, to be responsive, to be exciting, and maybe also have some variation, like climbing, or so that's why I said like it's similar to parkour, like climbing or crossing obstacles in other ways, or running and jumping, etc. And then also I would like to have meaningful interactions, so not just clicking and doing something, but also maybe moving things around a little bit, also having some sort of a spatial puzzle maybe. And then since I generally suck at narrative design and quest lines, then I decided, well, I'm just gonna hire somebody to do narrative design and maybe some level design for me, so I can have like a quest line in there as well to solve, so that everything would have a cohesive structure. And the prioritization for me is like, since I would like the interactions to be meaningful, to be crucial, then this has a 10. And the movement, while it is essential, I think it's going to be slightly less important to like focus on that, like whenever we're testing, for example, to the core idea of the game. And this is just my personal take. Yes?
Why'd you put $800 into something that has completely no importance to you?
Because it's something that I would like to have. If, let's say, I would make a walking simulator, like let's say also a small prototype, for example, then I would still like it to have some sort of narrative structure. And if I would put my time or somebody else's time on my team on everything else than that, then I would still need somebody to do it. So let's say a good analogy to this kind of, oh shit.
Oh yeah, that's exactly
There
the
we go.
question. Okay. Forget my
That makes
question.
sense though. That makes sense.
Yeah, that was the whole point. Yeah, basically, it's something that
Nice to have.
ties the game together, and that it's still something that I would like to have, but it's not going to be as important as the very basic like interactive experience by these other features. So, management. Shit. So before I was mentioning that it's mostly about emotional management when it comes to especially solo development, but this isn't. This is also true for a lot of team-based development. Like people might not realize this, but good managers are also acting as kind of a psychological support for their team, and good producers especially. As I mentioned before, they're supposed to be the glue between different departments. They're there to make things work better, to help people when they are stuck, to optimize workflows and just get people to get along. And also, one thing I haven't mentioned before, conflict resolution. A lot of it boils down to soft skills as a person, generally. To be a good manager, and especially a good manager to yourself, you are going to need to be mindful of your own needs, of your own capabilities, and basically know your own limitations. You will also require a very basic understanding about maths, but in a completely different way than when talking about budget, for example. Because when you're doing management, you're not crunching numbers anymore. You're crunching people, and mostly yourself. So the maths here is going to come down to previous experiences in a certain field, in a certain area, gauging your emotional response, figuring out how much stress you are willing to take, figuring out, for example, how many hours you are able to work this week. Something that I generally like doing and liked doing more in the past is at the start of each week on Monday or the day before on Sunday, I would try to figure out what I would be doing next week at work and prepare mentally for whatever I'm supposed to be doing. And this can go a long way into retaining your mental health and physical health as well. Because if you see that you have something planned for the next week, or if you don't, if you're going into next week without even knowing what you're going to be doing in terms of work life, it still helps to be prepared and mindful that, okay, this is going to happen. Most likely, I will be spending the entirety of Monday figuring out what the hell I'm supposed to be doing. And then you can set the tone for your week to come. You can use any sort of arbitrary time unit to do this sort of distinction. And it's mostly just to organize yourself, to give distinction to also when you are dealing with your professional life and your personal life. For example, for this workshop, this is for me actually allocated under personal life and not work. I don't consider this particular workshop to be work for me because I'm doing it in a different setting. I'm not doing it as, let's say, a representative of Placeholder Gameworks or Spelkollektivet. I'm just doing this as a person for other people, and that helps me also to set the tone for my presentation and also the contents of it, and basically figuring out what also my audience would want a little bit, considering who of you voted for what when I asked you whether you would want it to be more solo focused or team focused, etc. So this is mostly self-management in this case, and if you're an indie, then that's going to be one of the defining places where you can maintain efficiency. It's being mindful of what you are capable of, for how long, at what cost as well, and like to yourself in terms of mental and physical limitations, and also budget. So the tools here is basically your body and your ability to speak and communicate with other people, and being able to write things down. A lot of management boils down to actually writing down history, documenting stuff that happened, and making decisions and putting them down on paper so that they feel real. So let's say for today's workshop, we have a calendar in our room, and I marked it down. It's like white workshop, something like this, and I had that in my calendar, so I could like walk up to it and see it. It was a decision that I made, and I allocated time to prepare for it, and I allocated time to execute it. So why would you do this? Yes, question.
Yes. There's one problem which I've had a lot, and I think many other people probably also have it, and that's like, if you haven't already been through a game project and produced a game project, there's like no reference of knowledge for how you should evaluate things. Like you don't really have something to compare it to in your past experience, so you don't know how to compare it now. And also, one thing that's particularly, maybe very particular to our time, is that the development of technology in games goes so quickly all the time that we are often end up doing new things all the time. And how do you plan your week when you are basically have to spend your development time learning new things? Because you don't know how long it will take you before you like master this thing.
Yeah, that's actually a very good question. I will be talking about this a little bit more specifically later on, but I'm also happy to answer it in part. So let's say, how would I plan my week without knowing the exact time cost of something that I would need to master, for example? So when I'm learning a new tool or a new technology, then I usually start out with like everybody has their own different kind of way of doing it, but the way I do it is that I usually take one full day of reading about it, reading different sources about it. I'm not going to try anything practical. I'm just going to see the experiences of others using it, and I'm basically scouting for problems. I'm trying to I'm trying to learn from the mistakes of others, or also like the mistakes of the tool's developer, for example, and generally trying to map out the shortcomings of something that I need to learn, even if that shortcoming is myself, because let's say I don't have a lot of experience in writing shaders, so whenever I'm reading about shaders, I'm going to read about how other people have done it, how they have tackled the problem, and then I'm going to allocate an entire day for this, for example. And then, let's say if I would do it for a week, then day one would be just reading, no stress, no, let's say, no set goal for me to attain. And then the next 2 days, or rather, I would like to try out some simple use cases, try it out in a vacuum, so to speak, try it out in a specific setting where I can just do something simple, basic, and finish something like that I can see the end result of. And that's when I put pressure on myself. And then the next 2 days, I would be looking back at what I did and what I learned and doing the same thing that I did on day one, just now for longer, because now, most likely, I know which questions to ask because I have already touched upon a subject, and then I'm more proficient with the language used, because when I'm writing about shaders, I don't even know half what the variables mean, for example, but after tackling it and seeing like, okay, this is related to this, that's related to that, that might mean this, getting to know the terminology basically, doing practical work is great to ingrain terminology in your head, and I'm going to come back to this later in the workshop. That's also when I like to focus on that again and see what I can find out, knowing the subject matter a little bit better. So that's what I like to do for example, research or learning a new technique or a tool. Okay.
So to clarify, at the end there, you are going back to the step one and reevaluating.
And doing it for twice as long, basically. And also, no stress to myself, just trying to ingrain what I just did, and then in terms of practical stuff that I did, and then trying to now understand what I did with the new way of talking about things that I have learned, essentially. Cool.
I don't know if I can add something.
Yeah.
But I'm jumping on the color, the green, orange, and red. I have something like if I know nothing about a subject, I'm taking one day to just try to find all the documentation I can about this subject. It could be marketing or shader or anything. And then the day after, I'm reading everything. And then after I read, I just stop. And then the day after, I'm experimenting. So I don't know if it's a good way to do, but I get the habit of doing it.
Yeah, and this, I'm going to touch upon this soon as well. It's also a form of decomposition, of task decomposition, and that's going to be most of the third part of this talk. Okay, so management. Why would you ever want to manage yourself, or why would you ever want to have a manager on your team? Well, first of all, it's going to be putting you into a specific point in a timeline in your development most of the time. It's about knowing where you are with your project, knowing what your progress has been, and trust me when I say this, you probably have experienced this as well. Sometimes when you are so focused on your project, you're just doing stuff, you stop feeling the sense of progress. Even though you are progressing, it looks like you're standing still. It looks like you're not going anywhere. But if you just take a step back from it, and for example, if you have kept a development diary for yourselves, like keeping tabs of the tasks you have done, even if it's the simplest things, then you can take this step back and see that even though it doesn't feel like it, you have been progressing, you have been doing stuff. Even if it's like so-called procrastinating, there's also a thing that's called like professional procrastination, when a lot of people confuse with learning, I would say, because learning, especially like with learning, when you are researching a new subject or a technique how to do things, trying to establish a new workflow for yourself especially suffers from this. You might think that you're wasting time eventually, but you're actually not, because most likely you will be more familiar with the subject matter, more familiar with the topics and techniques you're supposed to be using, that you are going to do things quicker the next time you're going to think about it. It's basically you're spending time now to get a return on less time spent later. And this is perfectly fine to do. And it gives you a clear, if you do this, if you keep track of what you do, it gives you a clear vision of where you are, what you have done, and what's the consequence of this. And this helps a lot with guiding yourself, knowing what you should be tackling next, and also professional discipline, knowing when to push yourself and knowing when to cut yourself some slack, and knowing when to learn stuff or knowing when to put stuff into practical use. It's a lot to do with knowing your capabilities and knowing your limitations. And in larger teams, in companies, good managers, especially middle management, is crucial for this. These are the people who are there as a safety net for when you might not be making the best calls anymore, and they might be there asking, hey, are you sure you're supposed to be doing this task right now? Or maybe you wouldn't want to do something that's more interesting for you, so you don't get lost in whatever you're doing without feeling like you're just standing still. I've worked with both. I have been a manager and a managee. I've had good and bad managers, and for me the main difference between good and bad managers is usually, it's quite simple. It's honest communication and trust. A lot of it boils down to trust, and this can be also translated to solo development. You also need to trust yourself a lot. And this is going to sound a lot like a self-help book, but trusting your own subconscious and conscious decisions and your body as well. When you think about something and you react to it with disgust, then maybe it's not the best time to tackle this topic, even though it might feel like, if I do this now, it's just going to be done and over with. Maybe there's a better way of feeling better the next day and doing it then, and doing something else that doesn't burn you out as much the day before. So another exercise, and it's gonna get more and more complex now. So now we are doing feature estimation, and now it's a little bit more concrete. So we have time, we have money, we have the value or priority or importance of something, we have the department, or let's say the discipline that needs to deal with this, and also separately now we have the priority. So value and priority have been basically separated here. Value is, what would this feature give to the player in your opinion, and priority is in terms of budget and internal constraints, basically. So when you're thinking about this, first think about, can be again a completely random abstract game idea, whatever you've been thinking about right now. And then also you can see I put some real world things here as well, just to shake things up, like coffee and tea and rent and utilities. Think about where you would where you're most likely to spend your time, to spend your money. Then see what would give the most value to your player, and think about the priority for yourself. And in this case, the priority could be just as simple as, how much do I personally want to work on this right now? And for the department, it's basically just think again like abstract. Would it be something that would be for programming? Is it a programming discipline for you? Is it a design task for you? Is it like asset production? Is it audio? Is it management, like getting coffee and tea for yourself or paying your bills, etc.? I'm gonna leave this up for a little while. Gonna take some time.
What is one white box?
Sorry? White box, basically making a level schematic and without art, essentially. Just using white boxes or gray boxes or black boxes. Yeah. like a sketch. Can be something that's on a napkin, that's on a paper, that's in an engine, anything that you want.
Department means who's taking care of it, or?
Basically, it's rather the discipline. Like if you are a solo developer, then it's like, are you going to leverage your artist skills, your coding skills, your management skills, your design skills, etc. And it can be as abstract as you want it to be. I will tell you about the most important part of the exercise later on.
It's like we're making a chapter in an RPG.
That's kind of, yeah. You're giving a face to a project right now that you are imagining in your head. This is why I also wanted to keep it really open, that you would use your imagination, use your own project as an example, or just basically theory craft. And again, zeros are perfectly valid here, except for value and priority this time, because now the least should be 1, and the most important should be 10.
The problem that I have with kind of this setup is the 40 hours, I'm assuming it's a week of work.
Yeah.
Usually the way I organize myself is that I give myself 1 week completely devoted to one prototype instead of like switching between many of them throughout just 5 days. But so for me it's a little bit difficult to kind of like allocate the time to that, because normally when I think, okay, if I make a shooter, so the comic logic needs to be good.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna spend like this entire week now to just flesh out the combat. But that doesn't mean that I think like this is like the only thing that matters. I would then the next week spend the entire week on probably balancing animation, whatever.
In that case, the chart would look like you would put everything into combat logic, and it would obviously probably have the biggest priority, and it would have a reasonably high value number, and then everything else in terms of time and money would be 0, but they could still have a value and a priority. It's more about, like putting all of your efforts in just one thing is also very, very valid, and I was also hoping that somebody would actually go for this, because I tried to put like a lot of different weird stuff in here, as different as possible, so that it would be a little bit confusing, and that's also part of the exercise, finding where to focus. So the goal of this kind of estimation is basically to focus your efforts and figure out what matters to you most, and what do you think matters to your potential players in the end as well. So this combines budgeting, value estimation, and personal estimation. So the personal estimation is going to be the department and priority, whereas in the department you are basically figuring out which skill set that you are going to leverage for this task, and for the priority is basically how important it is for you. And these are also, for this exercise, let's say, one of the most important columns. And the second important column or area is the value, the stuff that other people would get from it. And also time and money in this case, while they are important in the grand scheme of things, you are going to be, let's say, a slave to your own priorities. So why did I mix in some real-world examples like coffee and tea and rent and utilities here as well? It's basically when you are managing your own daily life, most likely these are the things that might be going through your head when you're thinking about your game, when you're thinking about how you're just you want something to drink, you are thinking about how you're going to pay next month's rent. It's chaotic, and it's also but it's still like some kind of a cohesive picture, even though it's a mess of words in your own head. When you're managing stuff, this is just a little part of what you need to handle. Like essentially, you could expand this kind of calculation and method to everything you do in your day and give it some sort of a value. Even though that would be pretty pointless and time-consuming, it might still be an interesting exercise to see how specific of a value you would give to something that you do in your life, whether it's work-related or whether it's related to whatever keeps you in your lifestyle, essentially. So when Dennis asked, he said that for him, he likes to focus more on a singular thing for a longer period of time. That's a very good way of approaching this, because in this way, you tackle a problem and you commit to this problem. And you are putting your resources, your mind to it, and then that's going to be the main thing you are doing, and everything else will come second, but it's still important. It's still going to be still going to have to be solved, just maybe later on. And this is the main function of a management role in a company, or being a manager to yourself, is focusing and having clarity over what needs to be done and when. Yeah, that's, yes?
I wanted to add that for if you want to do one thing at a time, then you should manage a longer period of time like that, because when you start with something and you just do it, and when it's ready you start taking another thing, then your project could go forever. So if you're not doing it weekly, you could do it monthly or even yearly.
Yeah, you can have goals for yourself set for an arbitrary amount of time, I would say, and find the unit of time that works for you, and also try to do it as task specific as possible. But I'm not going to jump ahead of myself, and this is something that we'll talk about later on as well, about how to come up with proper task management and to decompose a problem into easily digestible parts. But now we're going to go into oversight, which is closely related to management tasks. So what is it all about? It's basically when management is figuring out what you're supposed to be doing and when and how important everything is, then oversight is trying to monitor the situation and see if it's actually going that way. So in larger companies, this is also one of the main tasks of project managers, of producers. They are looking at their time estimates they have gotten from their employees or from partners, like outsourcing, whatever, and they are there to see if things are going according to plan, and if there are deviations in these plans, and seeing whether or not there should be some sort of an intervention or a reaction to see if something should be changed. So there are, again, a wide variety of tools you can use. There's the Atlassian stack that has Jira, for example, for task management. You can log your time there. You can use Toggle. You can use Hack and Plan, for example, or you can use Google Docs and Google Calendar or Excel or Notepad or a piece of paper to track how much time you've been spending on things and how far you have gotten with whatever you've been setting out for yourself. It's all about being aware of the time that you have been spending and where did it go. This will help you, again, to optimize your usage of time more. It will help you to be more mindful and be more accurate in your estimations in the future. It can also help you learn yourself and your own capabilities more, and also identify when you're getting better at something. If you do the same fucking line of code for 10 times over, then you would expect that you would be able to come up with the solution more quickly in the future. So this is also goes down to optimization, a lot of it. And I have a very important sentence that I put here is avoid being reactive. And I mean it specifically in the case of avoid being reactive too early. Because if you commit to doing something, if you commit to trying out a feature, then it might be super tempting to be halfway there and see, fuck it, it's not worth it, I'll just toss it and try and come up with a new idea that's even better. You might end up in an infinite loop of half-baked fish, so to speak, that you will be never able to eat. You will never see the end result of something. You will never see or feel the satisfaction of seeing something in action. If you figure out something that works even a little bit, then it's also fine to see it through, to see that it fails in the end. Because this is going to still be a lesson for you, it's still going to be time spent, but that's time spent also figuring out why this thing is failing and seeing how it could be changed in a better way. Because if you put a new part into a system, if you add a new feature to your game, then you might see that, oh my god, it's like just not working right now, it's making the game worse, and that might be at the point where this feature isn't really, it's not working well together with other mechanics because it's had too little time, but then you might think, okay, maybe if I refine it a little bit more, then you can get somewhere. So oversight is basically monitoring your own commitment to whatever decisions you have been making, to see whether or not your assumptions are still valid and whether or not this is actually providing the value that you expected. And of course, that being said, it is very important to know when to quit on working on something. It's let's say it's something that you would have to, especially as a solo developer, you would have to be very mindful of yourself. Figure out when it's pleasant for you to work on something or when it becomes an absolute tedium and a chore and so annoying that you want to die of boredom. That's the kind of moment where you see, like, again, you can take a step back, see what you wanted to achieve with adding this feature, for example, or modifying the HUD, changing something in the user experience and seeing if it's actually worth it for you and if it's worth it for you to keep doing it. If, let's say, I would add a chat room to my walking simulator, it's like, wow, that sounds like a cool idea, and it might be a great idea in the end, or it might be an absolute tedium because I don't know how to make a web chat room, for example, into a game. So it's about figuring out whether or not you have made good decisions about the tasks you're tackling right now. And then, why would you do this? Mostly to get reassurance about your decisions, whether or not you are on the right track, seeing problems early and tackling them early, but not being too preemptive about it, so you don't fall into this loop of, I'll just try this same thing just a little bit different and starting over. It's more about, again, taking a step back and seeing what the initial thought was, what you were solving when you came up with this implementation or art asset or whatever. I think the Billy Bust Up team had quite an interesting process with their main character, with the goat, of how they redesigned it. And they went about it in a fairly mindful way of, they felt that it wasn't in line with the rest of their art, so they sat down, decided to redesign it, and you might think, like, in the end it doesn't look much too different, but they committed to it and they had some trouble with it, and in the end they ended up with something that was more consistent with the art style that they were working for, and they didn't really give up midway through. They committed to it, and in the end they didn't revert back to their initial goat. Now they have a new version of something and it feels fresh, and they had some interesting feedback from their fans as well. So basically they were always tackling it from the problem of something is off with this fucking goat, and ended up with something that's better for them. And it's also amazing for motivation, because when you're seeing something come together, that's great. When you're not, then you can take a step back and understand, okay, this isn't working, I need to readjust completely and figure out this problem from a different angle. So It's something to get you back in line again, back into work mode again, back being active. Another exercise. Oh God, yeah, this is the social media one. Yes. Basically, just to speed things up a little bit and to keep everybody from going insane, let's just do the last 2 columns, and I will shortly explain as well. So you have, let's say you want to get feedback on your game prototype that you made, for example, in a game jam or whatever, then you want to do marketing blowout to gauge market appeal for it. And now is the time to prioritize what, let's say, which of these techniques you would like to focus on more, and when would you like it to be done. Now the due date column is marked as 1 to 7. This means from Monday to Sunday. So you have 5 topics right now that should have their own due date when you want to be done with this, and then it has a priority saying like how important this is for you. And that's, I think, yeah, let's just keep it simple for now, and let's just fill out these 2 columns and see where we end up. I will just ask you a few questions from show of hands and fingers again.
What is CM?
Community management.
Community.
Again, completely abstract game idea. You can just think of something in your head, but you want to show it off to the public somehow. How would you tackle it, and how soon in a week would you like to be done with it?
Press.
Press is either press kit, which is like preparing marketing materials, and also reach outs, which is sending the emails part. So by show of hands, how many ones do you have in the due date column? By show of fingers, I mean. Okay. Now, by show of fingers, how many 5s do you have in the due date column? Okay. And now, by show of fingers, how many 7s you have in the due date column? Very cool. Very nice. How many of these, like let's say from this list, is there something, again, like by show of fingers, how many of these things would you not want to do at all? Okay, nice. Okay, good. Okay, so basically, the purpose of this exercise was to, again, like self-reflect a little bit on what would you want to be focusing on, and what things you feel like you want to do faster and get them out of the way, and what things you would want to do a little bit later. Or also, do you think there's some sort of dependency between these? Do you think like you would need to do something before another thing? And now, with that being said, I would like to ask how, let's say, how many of the things, or rather, let's make it easier. By a show of hands, is your priority for things in a correlation to the due date, meaning the higher the priority, the sooner the due date? Is this in some way correct for you? Okay, very good. Basically, there are no wrong answers here, by the way. It's all comes down to personal psychology. This is what I mentioned before as well in the management part. Basically, if you feel like going for something that you don't want to do earlier or want to do earlier, it's something that has to do with your own personal preference. And the most important thing about this is that you actually ask yourself this question. Because if you are mindful and aware of how annoying or how fulfilling it is to do something, and set an appropriate what is it called? Deadline? Yes. If you set an appropriate deadline for it, then you can be much more efficient at your work and also be mindful about your own needs. And this kind of an exercise is great to do, especially if you have already some sort of measurable amount of work ahead of you. You have a task list, and then comes the basically setting deadlines for yourself. And whenever you're doing this kind of thing, I would like to ask all of you to also ask yourself why you are choosing this particular deadline, for example, or why you are prioritizing this thing over the other. And just being mindful about this might help you make better decisions. It's something that I personally like to use. It's something that has helped me out from stressful situations, to like sprinkle in some goodies in the middle of bullshit whenever I've had to do some really tedious stuff. And it also helps me to, like personally speaking, retain my efficiency whenever I have a wide variety of tasks that I know that I need to do, and I have the freedom to choose when to do them. Now, the final exercise. Creative execution, or rather the final topic. Creative execution is a lot about putting the vision of a game into actual practice. It takes a lot of all the 4 previous topics to actually arrive here. And this is why good producers in the game industry are so I want to say sought after, and they're also extremely well paid, because there are people who are called fixers in the industry who basically get called into projects to make them happen, to push them across the line, to get out of a creative dead end or a production dead end. And this can also happen in a solo development situation very, very often. You get stuck somewhere, and you might even start thinking, why am I doing this? Nobody even wants to play this in the first place. So you get this kind of lost sense of meaning, and in big productions, usually a person from the outside gets pulled in who can look at things with a fresh look. And this is usually when you have a change of management or a change of leadership generally. But with yourself, you usually don't have that luxury, right? You can't exchange, like you can maybe have a brain hemisphere transplant, but I don't know the technology. So essentially, you would have to know yourself when to go back to the drawing board and figure out why you are doing something in the first place. This is especially prevalent for game projects that tend to drag on a little bit, especially if you go over your deadlines that you have set. It helps to just go back again, see the bigger picture, because that's what you're supposed to be doing when you are a producer. You look at the bigger picture and see how you can get to your intended spot, your intended product, the intended results that you had at the start, and to do it with the resources that you have in your disposal. It also helps if you are consistent with your estimations and your focus. If you have early on made a decision about your game that it's going to be focused on this specific thing, on this specific feature, this is going to be the game's strength, whether it's like narrative, visuals, game feel, a specific mechanic, something that's novel or something that's very personal to you, then keeping that in line with the other let's say the other assets, the other values that are in the game is super helpful, because you can have the best story possible in a game ever, but none of it is going to be of any consequence if you don't present it as such. So a lot of thought needs to go into how you are going to present the vision to the player, and in terms of organization and actually doing, making a game essentially, is you have to figure out, like I said before, the focus for your game, and also keep the level of quality consistent. This is usually one of the biggest challenges in game development. For example, in Disco Elysium, one of the biggest challenges was to make the game consistent with its production values, because it had some that were very, very, very high level and some that were underdeveloped. So a lot of time in the last part of the development for this game went into making the quality seem uniform, so it doesn't have this kind of weird change of tone or weird change of pace. And a lot of care and time went into, let's say, editing the writing, making art assets look consistent, that you don't have something that's there that has been like painted over 3 years ago and it's still there and it looks like crap and everybody knows that it looks like crap, so it needs to be fixed actually, because other people are going to look at it and see that it's, again, crap. So either you cut that or you bring it up to par. And a lot of this is basically made by your own best judgment. If you are the sole creative holder or the creative person responsible for creative decisions, then if you're a solo dev, then you're also going to have to execute it the best way you can, but that can be a little bit difficult. And why would you want to do this? Why would you want to be focusing on this so specifically? First of all, it gives you purpose. There's no real point in making something that doesn't have a point. Creative execution needs to convey what was meant to be said with the game, like for example with Death and Taxes, we wanted to get people talking about death. And so we put a lot of focus, a lot of like entry points in the game that would open up this discussion. We threw in some red herrings, we threw in some like awkward dialogues or awkward choices that made people question their morals about this very specific topic. Then secondly, this ties into management a lot. If you make a decision about a game, why something is the way it is, you need to have a good explanation for it. If you are going to put something in the game, the justification for it needs to be a lot more than it looks cool. And this can be very difficult to do because you can add stuff into the game, like let's say you have a shooter game and you add a whole bunch of cool visuals like particle effects and stuff, but if you're just doing it so that it looks cool, that's not really good enough, because you also have to figure out that, are these particle effects affecting the gameplay? Are they affecting players' visibility? Are they affecting the players' ability to navigate the terrain? Like, what are they there for? What is all of the stuff in the game there for? This is also a question as a producer which you would ask basically from every piece of design you get from a designer, from every piece of code or every implementation you get from a coder, every asset you get from an artist is like, why is this the way it is, and is it in line with the creative vision? And all of it boils down to having consistency in your project. This is very important, and this is I would say the sole factor that gives games what players feel as level of polish or production values, essentially. That was a lot. Do you have any questions about this? No? Okay, good. And this is going to be an easy one, because it's exactly the same one as the second one. So, knowing about, let's not do the exercise, but I will just have a question for you after I explain this. So knowing that you have some sort of creative vision in your head about this hypothetical game, and knowing where to focus on the game, and figuring out what gives the most back to the player and gives most satisfaction to you, would you change anything in the chart you made for the second exercise? Just by show of hands, would you change something? Having more time to think about it? You can quickly have a look. and you don't even like. Let's say we don't even need to do the show of hands round. It's basically just a little bit more self-reflection. If you think about these features, this feature list more, would you deprioritize something? Would you increase the priority? Would you throw something out completely? This is something that you would have to do with your own project constantly. This is what people mean in like the GDC talks when they say kill your babies, like not literally killing infants, but like learning when to let go of something, or rather also learning where to execute better. So what was this game? I can't remember. A beautiful pixel art game with neon colors, Hyper Light Drifter. So it was very interesting to see the development of this game and to see where the values you saw as a player kind of shifted a little bit over time. It kind of was meant as this, from the trailers and from the stuff you saw before, it was meant as this picturesque adventure of serene, very awe-inspiring, like a kind of architecture, monumental, and like having a sense of feeling that you are very small in this very, very large world. And they kept a lot of this core idea in their creative vision, but the execution was definitely different, because what you could see in the very early footages of the game and previews and screenshots was slightly giving off a different vibe than the final game. And this is exactly because decisions were made, conscious decisions. There are some really cool interviews with Heart Machine, with people who made it, Gamasutra, I believe, where they kind of explain how everything went together, what they focused on. They got an amazing sound producer for their game who made the music, the soundtrack, and all the effects for the game. And they made something that's consistent, and they didn't, like, let's say, they didn't leave anything out that was core or crucial to the game. And this is what good production basically looks like. It's identifying what is in the creative vision. If something is added to the game or taken away, does that affect the creative vision? And the execution of this is basically you deciding that this is going to happen, this is going in the game. And now it's time for a break. But thank you for bearing with me so far. I hope you have enjoyed it thus far. And after the break, we can enter the final talk, the final phase of the talk, which is about 20 to 25 minutes, I believe.
Go for it.
Essentially, now it's time for the conclusion and for some driving in the point.
Takeaways.
Yeah. So it's like production and management generally is all about seeing the big picture, and you are the photographer in this case taking the picture, and it's your assignment to explain what the big picture is to other people, even if it's yourself. It's about recognizing what is important for the creative vision, and it's also important that it's well justified and that it has value for everybody who is going to experience the vision that you envision. So I would compare the role of a producer to that of a co-driver in rally sports, because the specialist is the one in the driver's seat. They're the one driving the car. They're the one holding the wheel and applying acceleration and deceleration. No person like in management can do the work of specialists. No producer, like in teams at least, or even if it's the same person, can do the work of the artist, of the coder, or whatever, and vice versa as well. The point is, these are very different roles, specialist to producer. Specialist usually has hard skills, which means they have a specific skill set to solve a very specific problem, and as a producer, you're focusing more on the soft part. You're not focusing on the problem, you're focusing on how the problem fits in with all the other fucking problems that you have. And you're going to have a lot of problems to solve as a game developer in all of your projects. So to keep an idea of where the car is going, so to speak, you need somebody on the side reading the map and telling you where you are. Because if you're on the track going like 250 kilometers per hour, you are laser focused on the road and that you don't drive off of it. And this is where the producer would come in and say that take a hard right or whatever, just because that's the way things are going right now. You need to be able to adjust to another part of yourself telling you to do something differently or something, focusing on something more. It's a constant dialogue with yourself or in a team, a constant dialogue with another person usually. And also the main takeaway from all of the exercises that we did is that it's all about granularity, which means the division of things into smaller things. I'm going to drive in this point harder than a nail to the wall, but it's also something that you should take with a grain of salt because everybody is going to have their own different frameworks of how they like to structure things, how they like to visualize things, how they like to write things down. Essentially, remember that in a game project, you need to be sensible in your requests, especially to yourself. So set everyone involved reasonable goals that they can meet, reasonable and obtainable, something that's realistic. Like if I would say that I'm gonna, I don't know, start up Unreal and I'm gonna learn everything there is about atmospheric fog or post-processing in a week, then I'm just setting myself up to fail. It's all about, okay, so I want to learn a new thing. Where should I start? I should start with the documentation. I'm gonna read a little bit and see that, oh, this shit is complex. So I can adjust that my research period would need to be much more, for example. In Death and Taxes, we had a whole host of problems with player feedback, for example. And we had very little resources in our hands. We had to give the player feedback about their actions in the world, but we didn't want to corrupt the creative vision to give them like an Excel sheet to play with. So we gave them indirect visualization tools to get them to kind of understand what's happening, but not specifically, so that players could fill in these blanks themselves. And a lot of it was done within a lot of constraints and a lot of very specific decisions. Like we immediately decided no direct feedback. This was a specific thing that we put into writing and told everybody involved, this is not something we want to do, and everybody agreed. And then we took it to the next step. So what can we do if we have indirect feedback? And then kind of the ball started rolling from there. So making conscious decisions is quite important, and also being realistic in what you decide that should be done is, I would say, one of the most important skills to have. And now we're getting really to the crux of the talk. So mostly as a manager or as a producer, you are going to be working with task management the most. You're going to be working on what other people are going to be working on. And if it's yourself, you're going to be working on what you will be working on. And it always helps if you have a good, unanimously interpretable way of saying something that needs to be done, and also when. So a great tool for this or technique is what's called task distillation. This has some different kinds of terminology depending on which companies you've been working for or generally what you have been doing. But at its core, that task distillation is something that is used to make a specification for a feature or something that just needs to be done, and making it as specific as possible, making it as clear as possible to whoever should be dealing with this. So, for example, let's make a task. Let's say that let's make a background for a 2D game. So the task is make a background. So let's send that off to our artist persona over here and now I say that, okay, I just need to make a background. So the game is kind of like this. I'll say that, okay, it's gonna take me like 16 hours of work. And then let's see, the budget says that, okay, maybe 16 hours is a little bit too long. Maybe it should be more like 12 hours, so I can use the other day for 4 hours or something else. Okay, that's fine. Let's do that then. And then I see that I have this task. I have a task, make a background. It has 12 hours of work allocated to it, estimated. But I'm thinking like, but there should be some elements to the background and how it should fit into the scene and such. So I go back to the first step, and instead of saying make a background, then I ask, where should I be making this background? And it's like, okay, it's a scene in a forest. Okay, great. That already helps us a lot. So the task is now make a background for the forest. For like a forest scene, and then I see like, okay, great, I can actually distribute this or distill this even a little bit more. It's like, okay, so with the background, let's have different layers. So I'm going to have the grassland, and I'm going to have the foresty area, the canopy. I'm going to have some bushes as well. So now I have 3 tasks, one for trees, one for bushes, and one for ground, for example. And then I estimate the workload for all of these 3 elements in the piece that I'm making, and it's like, okay, so the trees are gonna take like, okay, let's start from the ground. It's gonna take like 3 hours. I can do like a couple of trees in 2 hours, and then I can make a bush in 1 hour, and it should look kind of okay. And then I go back into seeing what the budget is, and it's like, wait, I'm at 6 hours now instead of 12. And it's like, well, why did that happen? It's basically, if you think through and if you distill your task, you're more likely to overshoot less because you have a more specific idea of what you have in mind, and you already kind of know and foresee how you are going to solve the problem. And the more you do this, the finer the information is that you're going to get, the more specific it is, and also more granular. And this can be used to great effect. Like, personally, I've had a lot of problems with, let's say, stuff that is new to me, whether it's a tool or technique or a new coding language, for example, or a new game engine. And then I think that, okay, I need to do this very specific thing there, but it's actually not specific at all. It's like, let's say, implement character movement. And it's like, well, that can be anywhere between like 1 and 100 hours of work. So what am I supposed to do first? Okay, character movement, player input. Character movement, acceleration and deceleration. Character movement, jumping, maybe even. So you, instead of having this general idea of something, you take it into smaller parts, and then you have a much better idea of what's supposed to be happening. Now, in traditional game companies, usually you have the creative team, which is like art lead, art directors, sound directors, game designers who are going to do this task wording kind of for you, but you still need to figure out how to execute on it. So if somebody orders you a background for an area or a gameplay implementation for character movement, it's still up to you to divide these tasks. And if you're this one person doing all of this, it can get a little bit overwhelming. But whenever you feel like something is huge, like a task that's like, something that you think would take like 80 or 100 hours of work, figure out how you can make it into little sections that you can take and like do bite-sized pieces out of. So instead of saying that I'm going to work 100 hours on shading and lighting in this specific scene, you can have those divided into 2, 4, 6, 8 hour, 10 hour tasks, whatever, to help you get a better idea of where your time's actually going. It will be more accurate, and it will be much more rewarding for you in the end because you can see the progress. You can always cross something off the list, and you can come back to it, even if, especially for these like long things that take weeks. And then eventually, once most of it is done, you can just take the step back and see, oh wow, like I have so many things that I have actually done. It might not look like much, but at least I have done something. I have learned something. So that wasn't the final exercise. There's one more, and this is an abstract example of task distillation, and let's do a fun game of everybody tries to come up with a subtask for each of these. So let's say we got a demand for main character art. Let's say it's a 2D character. The perspective doesn't really matter, but we need to have concept art for it. We would need to have a default pose to kind of, let's say, like the default asset that you would see in the game. It would need to be animated. It would need to have some key art that would be featured in marketing. It would need to be supplemented by some VFX, whether it's like directly applied to the asset or applied in post-processing. And maybe also we would need to have a separate dedicated portrait for the character, which is like in a higher definition and a higher resolution for it. So, does anybody have an idea how to divide the concepts task, for example? What would you figure out as a task in concept art?
Clothing.
Yep, clothing.
Our outfits, our props.
Yep, perfect.
Characters.
Like faces, expressions.
Yep.
Or maybe first like find reference material.
Yeah.
And then do the concepts of like do free concepts.
Yeah, that works.
Write a backstory.
Yep. Yeah, that's very good. Basically, you already have a better idea of like what it takes to come up with a concept for a main character, essentially. Then next, let's say default pose. What would you imagine? How would you divide that? What would you need to put a character into their pose? Yeah.
Rigging.
Yeah, rigging, for example. Yeah.
Testing in a way, like if the pose is readable from a distance.
Yep. Yeah, doing like how do you call it?
I don't know what's the word.
There's a term for it. There's a really cool term for it. I don't remember. Yeah. Level of detail. Yeah, exactly. There you go. Then any else? Palette is always something that you would need to test. For example.
Shading.
Context, if it works in a dark environment, light environment.
Yeah. Then next one, animations. What kind of animations could you have?
A ton.
Okay, so like with animations, it's like you could have infinity animations, right? It's basically, yeah. It's basically
animations.
Movement.
Yeah.
Interactivity animations like picking up items.
Picking up.
Combat animations for spells or like swinging a sword, etc. Then you could also have emotes.
Yeah, expressions. Yeah.
Yeah.
And now you already again like you have a general task in your mind, and now it's like you can apply this kind of method to everything in your project. Like let's say you have 3 characters in the game, 3 main characters. You're making like an adventure game, and there's no other characters in the game, and that's it. And then you can do this kind of estimation and breakdown for all of the tasks, and eventually you're going to end up with a bunch of information of how much time something will take, of how much variety of content that you will have, and then you can apply budgeting, then you can apply prioritization, then you can do value estimation and see like which one of these is actually worth keeping. Which one of these makes the game better? Which one of these basically executes the game's creative vision? And you can, like, it doesn't apply to art. It can apply to, like just doesn't apply to just art. It applies to implementation. It goes to art direction as well, game design as well. If you're doing feature design, like, or gameplay mechanic design, it's like, okay, so I'm gonna have combat, and that's really broad. And then you can break it up into little pieces, like single target combat, multi-target combat. What's the player input like? Do you need to have some sort of feedback system, etc.? You can just break it down more and more, and then you understand your own design more and have a better idea of also how to execute it and estimate what the real effort is, the measurable effort that goes into making it. So yeah, this is the point I'm going to basically hammer in as well, is you need to deconstruct when you're thinking about your projects as a producer. Deconstruct as finely as possible. With, like, you don't need to overdo it, of course. Usually, if you are at a point where you're not able to ask yourself anymore, like, is this gonna take too much time, or is this, like, do I actually understand how to do this? If you have a feeling of, okay, and now I have a pretty good idea of what I need to be doing, and you know the steps you need to take to get this thing done, then you're already in a pretty good place. When you still don't know about, like, okay, how should I be doing this, then you can supplement that with additional research time, with experimentation, and it's all, like, all of this effort will go towards you having a better idea of how the fine things, how the day-to-day things fit into the bigger picture. So, like, by show of hands, how many of you have ever taken apart a toy in your childhood and tried to put it back together again?
Do Legos count?
Yeah?
Yes.
And how many of those attempts were successful?
Very well, yeah.
Right. Yeah, like, it can be or it might not be. And this is also kind of what a producer would need to do, or anybody who's thinking from a management perspective. It's like, whenever you take something apart, you also really, really need to figure out how it all fits back together again. Because this is one, it's always like a push-pull kind of relationship with yourself. It's, if I want to add this new feature, is this going to fit into the creative vision? Do I have time for this? Is it going to be worth it? Am I going to like making it even? So you have all of these considerations, and you have to make a judgment at one point whether or not this thing is going to be worth your time. And this principle can be applied to practically everything that you do in a game project. And again, like, this can be applied to real life as well, when you're thinking, like, do I want to have a drink with Adam or something? And then you think, like, okay, so I'm gonna have to buy some beers, and then I'm gonna have to, like, come back from the store, I'm gonna have to sit on my chair, and then I'm gonna have to spend some time, and, and like, you can break things up, activities or tasks, into discrete steps, and you will have kind of a better understanding of what it goes, like, what goes into your own thought process. And this is the best way to build up trust with yourself, because for me, when I worked as a producer, one of the most important things for me has been trust with people who I give a task to, and also myself, because I'm also trusted to make the right decision with giving somebody a task. So it's up to me to figure out how that fits into the team. And whenever I'm doing something by my own, then I'm also building up trust with myself, thinking like, okay, can I trust myself that I'm not going to spend more than 16 hours on this stupid shader shit and actually get on with the gameplay, for example? Or like, and it might not be like stupid shader shit at all, but that just might be the way I feel at the time. It might be something that feels useless, but actually has a great reward if it's in. It's all, yeah, like I said before, it's a lot about push-pull, a lot of thought into figuring out how you're going to execute something, what's the effort behind it, and what's going to be the payoff. Yeah, okay. Wait, what do I need to cover more? Okay, yeah. In terms of like actual procedure that you would need to take as a producer, so like for features, you should do a lot of value estimation to see like whether or not this thing needs to be in the game. You need to be able to justify it, like why is it in the game? What does it convey? How does it tie into the creative vision? If you're doing a roadmap, make sure that you actually have an idea, a very basic idea of how much time you're like developing your game would take before you do a roadmap. Because if you make a roadmap of saying, oh, I should be done by the end of 2021, without actually laying down the steps how you're going to get there, that roadmap is going to hurt you more than it's going to help you, because it's so vague and possibly quite far away that you might have an idea of all the things you need to do, but if you don't set certain like milestones or checkpoints for yourself to see how you're doing, you might lose vision, you might spend too much time on something that's not going to give you a lot back. It's just can open a can of worms that's going to be hard to clean up later. Same can be said with workflows. If you feel like you're spending too much time doing something, it feels like, oh, this could be improved, but you never take the time to improve it, then again, you're just going to make yourself suffer. If you spend 10 hours of your time to save 50 hours in the future, it's well worth it. It's even worth it if you spend 10 hours and then save 12 hours in the future, because probably you won't be hating the thing you will be doing that much. And finally, budgets as well. The more granular you get with your budgeting, with figuring out how much something costs and figuring out how much time you have and how much time you allocate to things, you'll have a very good idea of, or rather a better idea of what it takes to finish your project. And coming back to what Amici asked earlier about, let's say you're in a situation where you have never made a game before from start to finish. If it's like if it's your first production from start to finish or first solo production from start to finish, you don't have anything really to compare to. And that's still quite okay. What you can compare to is things you have made in the past. You can rely on your own experience thus far and use that as the basis of a new framework, because most of the time you're going to have to be making it up as you go, and that's all right, because this is going to give you the skills needed to take the next steps. So what I would say is a good procedure to do is to make a game that's quite small and at least get familiar with all the steps required of doing it. This is why game jams are an absolute pleasure and really, really good of giving you an idea what it takes to have a finished product. It's very small scale, but it's still a scale. It's 72 hours, for example, or 48, or 1, or 24 hours. It's still something that you make a conscious decision. These are the things that are going to get in. I'm prioritizing these, so some things are going to get thrown out. And eventually, this is an execution of the creative vision I had. You can do this with larger, progressively larger and larger games. to see how it works out. And like, if we go really like high level, then you can also try this out with releasing games on the App Store, on Steam, on itch.io. Just do it once so that you're kind of familiar with this, of where you need to get, of what's your goal, what's like the endpoint. The endpoint is usually you push the launch button on Steam or something, or on itch, for example. So just doing it even as a practice, it doesn't have to be serious. Like, you don't have to make, you can submit a game to Steam that's like half-assed and isn't really meant for commercial, as a commercial product, but at least you have taken yourself through the steps needed to get to that final like finish line. It's a completely like, I would totally recommend this kind of thing, and it's very valid to go there. And then once you have these bits and pieces of like information of, okay, I learned that I need to do this, and then I learned that maybe I could do this thing a little bit better, and then you build up slowly your skill set and your framework, so you can make more informed and better decisions in the future based on your past experiences. Yeah. Then point number 4, don't be afraid to delegate stuff. And this is going to be really difficult when you're one person. But if you're like adamant at being one single person, like Lucas Pope style or something, and even he didn't do all of the stuff on his own, really, don't be afraid to ask for help, ask for consulting, or ask for a partner in one or other aspect of the game. I know that for a lot of people, creative integrity is important, but it might help you put things more in perspective and also get a feel for the bigger picture. So let's say most of my skills are either coding or management related. I don't really know how to do art, so if I would do some sort of like project estimation for something, I would feel much more comfortable having an artist do a sanity check on my numbers and my estimations to see if like I'm way off for whatever my scope is, but they don't actually need to be specifically involved in the project. It's just asking for another pair of eyes who has more opinions or more information and more experience generally. And then the last part, which I feel is one of the most important parts of making a long-term project generally, is to simplify and optimize your own way of working, and especially the language about the game that you're using. So what I mean by language, let's say you come up with a feature and you describe it to someone, and it takes you 10 minutes to actually describe what the feature is and what it does. You can get much better at this if you do this task distillation on it a little bit, do some estimations on it, think about it more, think about how it works, think about what it's supposed to give to the player, and then you will come up with better words to describe and a more efficient way of speaking about your game to others and yourself as well. Again, like real world example, from Disco Elysium, we had a wide variety of words and terms for like our design language internally. And we had something in the game that's called THC. So some people might think that it's tetrahydrocannabinol, which is the psychoactive ingredient in cannabis, but it also meant thought cabinet. But it was something that was memorable and it was easy, and everybody knew what they were talking about when they said THC. It wasn't about weed, it was about the thought cabinet. And having these terms and having this glossary about your game is going to be so much more easier for you to like brainstorm with yourself or brainstorm with other people. So this only works if you're already kind of familiar with the subject matter. So if it's you, then you have the power to also simplify the language that you use. So instead of having, for example, in Death and Taxes, instead of having the choice part where you decide whether somebody lives or dies, we say paperwork. It's the paperwork. It's the paper you get on your desk, and that's what you mark. You do the paperwork. If you have your interview with your boss, Fate, about your workday, about your performance, then we don't say all of that. We just say dialogue. That's it. It's just one word. And the more shortcuts you have for this, the more efficient that you will become, and also it will help you talk about your game to others as well. Like, you have to kind of teach them the language a little bit, but it's going to be more efficient and it's going to be more universally understandable in the end. And now, homework, if you want. Basically, since I don't want to go too deep into this kind of thing with the time that we had, maybe if people want, we can have some sort of a follow-up where it's more practical. But here are some exercises that are quite abstract that you can just apply and just see how you would approach this kind of problem now. Like, for example, making a roadmap, figuring out how much time your game would take, putting in checkpoints, and then seeing how realistic that is. One of my favorite exercises are memory exercises. So, like, a lot of management and production work goes into documenting decisions made about the game, documenting and maintaining that documentation as well, and like creating this cohesive design language as well. I really like this exercise. So basically, the next time you have lunch or dinner or have a chat with somebody, try to remember what was talked about. Then after this thing is over, write it down somewhere on a piece of paper or a notepad and do it as well as you can remember. Just do it as finely as you can remember. Like, if you can, just if you have the superhuman ability of like remembering actual phrases that people said, try and make it into a little screenplay. Just person says something, other person walks in. Just try to remember this moment, this time, and try to describe it as well as possible, because when you're making games and when you are coming up with design ideas, the most valuable thing is what you come up with. And if you don't write that down, your memory can be fallible and you can just simply forget about it or remember it in a different way that might be less valuable. And you can just do this you can apply the same kind of exercise to an actual like brainstorming or design session, or like you sit down, you think about your game, and then you just, instead of keeping it in your head, you just write everything down and give it a timeline. And you don't have to do this every time, but just as an exercise. So let's say at, I don't know, 8:15, I came up with this idea of whatever. And then like 8:25, I came up with a different idea to support this. And like 8:27, I came up with the idea of none of this works, and etc. Just keeping a log of your own stream of consciousness. And then you can analyze and see how you think and how you can maybe optimize the way you analyze things. And that's, I believe, it. Thank you. So that was a lot. Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, I have a couple of ones.
Yeah.
I thought this talk was going to be a little bit different, so my questions are a little bit more specific. When it comes to developing a game, because I thought we were going to talk about pre-production, post-production, and production, and all that, you know. And when it comes to developing a game, at what time should you start worrying about two things? Serialization that you and localization.
So the question,
So like you start with the prototype, right, and then you go into production. At what stage should you start worrying?
So the question was mostly about when, at which production stage you should be worrying about serialization and localization, always the answer is going to be at the start for these kinds of things. It's usually like there are a couple of main things that the answer is at the start. The first is multiplayer or single player. That is one thing that should be tackled at the start right away, even before pre-production at the idea stage. Secondly is localization, also preferably at the idea stage. And serialization, it's something that should be considered after you have done your first prototype. But generally speaking, if you are at a point where you know what your game's data structure is going to be like vaguely, then it's also time to start thinking about it. Because serialization can have, you can do it in quite a few different ways depending on what your skill set is and how much you're willing to learn. But it's something that is ultimately part of the core architecture, so to speak. So if we're talking about like technical direction and technical decisions, then as early as possible is great, because having a solid architecture for your game as early as possible without any sort of supplementing feature set is the best thing you can do for yourself, because it's something that's going to take you, it's going to deprive you really from making all the cool stuff, like actually making the game, so to speak. But it's something that's actually going to save you a lot of brain cells and time in the future. And this can be also done really at any stage of development. But it's, let's say that you go into development of a game and you think you might want to do localization in your game. Then you can go into development thinking like preparing for it, but not explicitly accommodating for it. So basically you would set up your architecture in a way that if you really did need localization in the end, you would make it less hard on yourself to convert the project to be compatible with it. So just keeping in mind a few things, but not going fully into it, because it might just be still a big question mark in your head. But still, I find it better if you make the decision right away and use patterns of development that you can actually apply, whether or not, like apply immediately for localization, like whether or not you will have it in the end anyway. But if you think that you will have it, it's better to decide this early and also start developing, keeping this in mind early. Anyone?
Pardon me, what is exactly serialization?
Saving and loading files.
Yeah, like basically, yeah, saving game state, essentially. Yes.
Do you have any tips for optimists in the sense of people that, or like, I am often like estimating my time too optimistic, and it kind of gets frustrating. Like, yeah. So do you have any tips on how to get better at time estimating other than tracking yourself and these kind of things?
Usually, estimating gets better the more time you put into it up until a certain point. It's mostly about this, like analyzing the problem. And being optimistic is like the other end of the spectrum, where it's like you just, for safekeeping, you just overshoot the entire thing, multiply the estimation by 2, and it's like, I'm definitely going to get this to work at this time. But if you're doing like finer task estimations, then I find that it might be easier to basically, if you don't, especially if you don't have any like previous thing to compare it to, then just adding some sort of, if it's like something that's unknown, then adding like a flat number before that to accommodate for the unknown factor. Some people also like doing all like these kinds of like design exercises on tasks, like basically having like a make believe. I'm going to do this now, and figuring out like again like going through the things step by step, and like visualizing yourself behind the computer and keyboard or tablet or whatever, and thinking like, okay, so what would I be doing, and how long would I be doing this for? And then taking that visualization and adding in like again like a factor of I don't know, procrastination or whatever, or adding a buffer in there. Generally speaking, if you are tending towards more optimistic estimates, then I would say gather intelligence on which tasks you have been optimistic about, see if there's a common thread there, and also with that information, if you figure out where you are being too optimistic, then you can apply like a flat out multiplier there, like say, okay, this is dealing with this area, so maybe it's better for me if I double that estimate, for example, just to see if, just again, like for safekeeping. And it's fine if, let's say your estimations are off by 2 times or more, then it can be a big problem. But most of the time, if you have like something that you estimated as 10 hours of work, but you take 12, I think that's nothing to worry about. If you estimate something as 10 hours and it turns out to be 40, then it's something that you would need to probably look at separately and figure out why that happened, and figure out if there's something that you can do to prevent it in the future.
I would like to add that this is exactly what I'm doing. When I'm thinking that I will take 2 hours to do something, I say to myself that I give me 4 hours. So usually I do it in 2 hours, half or maybe 3 hours, but I feel super happy when I finish because I have 1 hour for myself.
But generally speaking, overestimating is a little bit better than underestimating, like in terms of constant patterns, because if you are following a timeline, if you have a budget, if you have a roadmap, then if you take this all into account with a buffer, then in the end, if you finish earlier, that's just going to mean probably more polish. It's better to slightly overestimate than underestimate. Yes?
Yeah, I was thinking about the same thing, but I have kind of like a counter. Sometimes if you overestimate how much time something takes and you finish early, it's very difficult to be motivated for doing more because you're kind of like you well, like me especially, because I kind of need to plan my, like I have need to have like idea in my head about how things are going to go, and if there is no idea about how things are going to go, I kind of just I kind of don't feel prepared to start something new, like a new task, just even though there's like hours left.
Yeah, I completely understand that, and this is something that when I said like try to be mindful about what your week is going to bring, like you can either be prepared for it, but if you are not, then I would just say stop when you're ahead. You did it earlier, and this is fine now, and you can proceed as normal. You don't have to force yourself, especially if you're unprepared, to go through with adding something on top. Yeah, Christian?
What do you feel about instead of using like a specific hours, using like some arbitrary like bananas or something?
Yeah.
Time estimate?
That's what I do. I'm gonna show this soon as well, like a tool that I use to do estimations for projects and for budgets and such. Fraser?
Right, so we're talking like with multi-year projects, do you have any strategies for keeping your plan resilient to unknown things that can come up? Like if you suddenly need to finish the game in 3 months because of some opportunity or PCs die or whatever?
Basically, yeah, there's the force majeure argument. That's something that you depending on the project you're working in and depending on how long it is, it's something like, it's gonna sound severe, but in case of death, what would you do? Basically, like if some person, or like not death like physically speaking, but death in terms of like project or somebody falling off from the project, like having an extreme case that basically you can think of but you can't really account for. It's something that you can't really have a contingency for. You can only acknowledge that this is a possibility that might happen, but it's something that might happen in such an unknown moment that you have no way of adequately preparing for it. So if you have a long-term project which like you would like to have this kind of force majeure factor into it, then you can make a risk assessment of the most likely places to fail, like losing home, losing work tools, losing funding. You can have somewhat of a contingency for this, like a backup plan that you can execute without like having too much to worry about. Like have an agreement with a friend that if your computer breaks, you can loan theirs. For example, if you lose your home, for example, or lose your office, like both can be pretty bad, but one is definitely worse than the other, then figuring out like what's the backup for that. Just generally, it's not something that you can really specifically prepare for. It's something that you would have to tackle when it happens a lot of the times. It can be difficult. Like whenever I've had like bigger estimations for whole projects with complete budgeting and everything, then I try to add a buffer for like unknowns. And a lot of the time, this buffer can be up to like 20 to 25% of the entire thing, just because accounting for like professional mobility, like somebody quits and somebody else needs to take their place, or like hardware or licenses, software licenses would need to be updated, or something else like falls through. And it all depends on length of the project. Most of all, the bigger the length, the bigger the risk that you will lose out on equipment or people, and also the like technical complexity, I would say. If you can run Unity on a potato, then you can probably finish your game there. But if you need to have a rig that renders 3D at 60 FPS to make sure that you're giving quality content, then it's a different kind of story.
In that example, you would probably it's probably smart to invest in insurance for your computer also. Like often when you buy expensive computers like that, you can get an insurance.
Yeah, having a warranty is great.
Yeah, that
Sounds nice.
Move some months while you're getting a replacement.
Then
Lost work and time.
I can show you real quickly
That's an exaggeration.
what
But
I
then you have a
use.
pacifier.
And it looks like shit, but it works. So this is basically an Excel sheet. You can't really read it, so I'm gonna read it out for you. So this is a super distilled version and a better version of the stuff that I do, for example, in Notepad or in my, like, with a pen and paper. So what I do is I list all of the tasks for a project that I can think of in a reasonable amount of scope. In this particular example, it's quite specific. It's like has very specific things, like features, or like levels or UI elements or design elements, for example. And then I just put them in this convenient, column. Then I like give them a department. I call it topic. It's either gameplay, UI, level design, game design, balance, sound, VFX, or animation, for example. Then it's the expertise, which is like the skill set required to solve this, coding design, visual design, and sound design. There should be more. And then the priority. So I have, it's like a dumbed down version of Jira, for example. and then I have a priority for it. Essential meaning that the project will not ship without it. Recommended meaning that the thing will definitely help the creative vision. Nice to have, and everything below that is like literally something that should be only tackled if there is extra time. And then I have the estimate. And what it spits out here is this like estimate list. And it gives me an idea of how many man hours and how many how many man days, man months it would take. I do like re-estimations occasionally when I do estimations for projects. So I like chronologue a log of what the estimation was then and what it is now, and if something has changed, and adjust it to the hours already invested. And this is just something that I have come up with myself for managing my own work, managing my own tasks. And that's something that I encourage everybody or you to do as well. Not like exactly like this, but it's just goes to show that you can just make your own tools for managing yourself, managing your work, having like stuff in Google Calendar, having stuff mapped out like I'm going to work on this today, and having alarms for it, for example. Anything you feel that would help you work better and be more efficient is fair game, essentially. I just use this spreadsheet. I can send you this if you want. I can put it into the chat. It's a public list that I've shared with a lot of people, I would say. How to like section off things, how to make things granular, how to basically estimate how much time a specific like topic would take and how complex it would be generally. Yes.
What do you have in the notes for the estimation? I think you have some do you compare your estimates to how much it actually took, or?
Yeah. I have additional granularity here.
Oh my gosh.
So basically, each of this task is either marked as done, which is K, or it's basically divided into subtasks. So basically, this would be the first pass of stuff, and then in the notes, in the estimate, I just divide it even further. And I've used, like, for every estimation that I do this thing differently. But it's been pretty reliable so far. Like, I use a pretty high buffer rate for stuff, and with, let's say that usually for me, if I do an estimation for a game project that's like about 1.5 years of production, which has half a year of pre-production included, or half a year to a year, then the estimation has been off by like 20%, which is not too bad. I've used this commercially as consultation, and it's if it's a small time project, then it's just one way of handling stuff, and it's mostly there. I use it for business, mostly for business consulting, so which goes under like production, but you can do something similar for your own like personal day-to-day tasks for your projects. I don't know. It's literally just one way of doing it. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to the pressure about losing your computer. Also, always back up on GitHub or something like that.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Always.
I have lost all my data once.
Always backups. Have backups in another person's computer or on a separate data drive, and it's always good to have 2 layers of redundancy.
Sponsored Blackbase.
Yeah.
Well, one for the cloud, maybe like one can be the like in a
Exactly.
hard drive.
One of the best setups is first the copy that's on your computer, then the copies that's on everybody else's computer who we're working with. Then the redundancy comes from offline copy, and then cloud copy. That's like even the worst case, it would take a lot to have like a confluence events for all of these four to hit the fan. Like,
And if that happens, I think you have other things to worry about.
yeah, exactly. If that happens, then it's probably a bigger problem than just whatever is happening with your project. It's probably
The
the
world is
world is
probably
falling
burning.
apart. Yeah.
I don't know if it's a good advice, but it's working for me. But I'm making a lot of mini tasks, like we done, and I'm making a lot of checklists.
Yeah.
So when I check on my list, I feel super happy.
Yes.
Like I am a shot of dopamine. I feel like I've done something.
Yeah.
So practice, it's definitely something you have to practice consistently.
Yes, definitely. It's about self-discipline and getting into the routine of doing these things as well. And eventually, if you practice this enough, if you incorporate it into your daily routines enough, you will be doing like it's second nature. And that's when it starts to pay off. First off, it's going to feel tedious. It feels like it's going to take time. But the main point is it's going to save you time in the future. It's going to be like an investment. It's about the long-term reward, essentially. It's going to help you. Okay.
Let's wrap up.
Thanks, Ott. That was awesome. Thank you for